Okay, we're now up to the final part of the main practice here. So in the sutra, this is the section on the Four Noble Truths. But I'm just going to very briefly review where we've come to. So we looked at the first section, contemplation of the body, starting with the breathing, and then looking at the other aspects of the body, like the parts of the body, postures of the body, and so on. Okay. Well, there's a lot in it about how the body decomposes, the impermanence of the body. So, those practices, we get to know our body, our physically embodied beings, okay? And it's very important to ground our meditation in awareness of the body. So that's why we do that first. And also the relaxation, very important to create the right state of mind, the right atmosphere in the mind. Then the next, so the second part of the practice, in the sutra, is about the feelings. We notice feelings, and they are, to a great extent, they're very kind of connected to the body. So it's a natural progression. Okay. So when we have feelings arise, there is invariably some kind of bodily state or bodily process that is associated with that feeling, that is, if you like, is causing that feeling. Or, sometimes it may feel like it's just a mental state. We're a bit bored, or we're a bit, if we're tired or sleepy, that's a bit of both, isn't it? But often those, what we think of as a mood or a mental state, or a feeling of feeling a bit, depressed or whatever, but actually there's a physical condition which is really what we're experiencing, and we're interpreting it in terms of a mental state. So then the next thing obviously is moving on to the state of mind, moving more towards the mental side. So there isn't this, as he points out in the text, in Buddhism, there isn't this idea of the mind and body being two completely separate things. Sometimes you talk that way, in especially in the Tibetan tradition, there's a bit of, talk about that the mind is not physical. Well, the mind isn't physical, but at the same time, our experience is very dependent on the body. And when we are, rather than thinking or theorizing about the body and the mind, when we're experiencing them directly in meditation, then, but just perceiving the body and the mind, then often we don't find this separation between the two. This is my experience anyway. But there's kind of like a spectrum from the more physical to the more mental aspect of what's going on. So we move our attention, we can look more at the physical side, we can look more at the mental side. What's the content of this thought or this emotion that's arising? But then the fourth section is really looking more at the details of what's going on in consciousness, the sort of the more I'm going to say more conceptual, but it's not quite conceptual, but it's more about the specific content of the experience. So different, mental factors like, these 5 hindrances: sense, desire, anger, sloth and torpor, agitation and worry, doubt. The 5 aggregates, of course, some of those are physical and some of those are mental. But again, it's a little bit more thinking about things, if you like, recognizing these different categories of the components of the self. It's not just the parts of the body, but also the parts of the mind, what it is that we consist of, if you like. So we consist of, the physical body, the form aggregate, the feelings aggregate, the perceptions, thoughts. In the Tibetan tradition, we tend to talk about compositional factors. Here it's translated mental formations, which may be better actually. It refers to things like, karmic actions, intentions, emotions, and then consciousness itself. So we can pay attention to those things that are arising in our flow of our experience. The 6 sense bases, so the 5 physical senses, sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch, the sense organs, the sense perceptions themselves, okay, and our internal reactions to those. So, so here it's mainly talking about how those things give rise to, some kind of, attachment, really, mainly. Oh, and also the mind, the 6th sense being the mind, okay. Then these factors of enlightenment. So these are the positives. We looked at the negatives, the hindrances and the fetters, but then the enlightenment factors of mindfulness, investigation of reality, energy, rapture, tranquility, concentration, equanimity. So these are the positive mental factors that are causes for enlightenment, realizations. So to notice when those, I didn't include those in the meditation. I thought about including them in the meditation. We put quite a lot into the meditation. But do notice, if those things, oh yeah, there's some mindfulness there. There's some tranquility, okay? Yeah, calm, in a state of, peaceful mind. Very important. Equanimity, okay? So these do happen in our meditation. You're not completely absent. Some of the time they are, but some of the time those are there, and then we can, oh, great, okay, no, that's important, that's significant. Not to get carried away by it, because then it can just disturb our mind. Our mind becomes very excited, No, it's just they come and go like everything else. But there it is, we are not. Sometimes it's important to reflect. Maybe we're not as far from enlightenment as we sometimes think we are. Yeah, we can get stuck in that. Oh, I'm miles and miles away from enlightenment. I'm never any kind of enlightened state in my mind. But if these factors are arising, and they do, mindfulness. Okay, right now, yes, there's mindfulness there. Energy. Sometimes we have that. So this is what we've been looking at. It's quite a wide range of things. And then this last one, which I think is only in the 2 versions of the original sutra, and this, I think maybe they're in very short form in one version, but then in this version that is translated here, which is from the Digha Nikaya, which is the collection of long discourses. There's another one in the Majjhima Nikaya, which is the collection of middle length discourses. But this one that's here translated has got a very full section on the 4 Noble Truths. So up to this point, and I was bringing this into the meditation a little bit, as well as just noticing that those things are going on, then as we get more familiar with the practice, it's useful to bring in awareness of the impermanence, momentary change. Okay, all these things are changing moment by moment. That's really a very important aspect of the meditation. Okay, so this is more, going a little bit beyond just bare attention. We are bringing attention deliberately to recognizing the impermanence, recognizing the moment by moment change of everything that's going on in our experience. Also noticing, so there's three factors that are the characteristics of reality that are, they're said to be, which is impermanence, suffering, and selflessness or emptiness. Okay. If we recognize that everything is impermanent, then we don't get attached in the same way to, grasping to, I want this. If we can accept everything is changing, so we can, appreciate what's happening now, but not be attached to it because it's going to change. Okay. But also we can recognize that this kind of background dissatisfaction, that nothing, very seldom is it the case that our experience is completely, everything that we would ever want it to be. Yeah, there's this underlying, might call it unease, or very subtle kind of dissatisfaction. In other words, we've got further to go. We might be having a good experience, but as long as it's not everything that we would want it to be, there was dissatisfaction. And this is kind of bringing us into this last thing of the Four Noble Truths. I'll talk about that in a moment. But we can just notice it, first of all, just notice that it's there. And also noticing this aspect of non-self. So when we bring our mindful awareness into, our inner world, if you like, two things that we can recognize. One is that all the time, as we're thinking, behind every thought and every emotion, there's a sense of me. There's a me that is having that thought or having that emotion, right? Now, where is that? Can we find that? The answer is we can't. There's an idea of it, I have this sense of me, but if I look, all that I find is the physical body, the feelings, the changing state of mind, the thoughts and emotions and perceptions that are there, consciousness. None of those things are me. You can't find that me. In fact, we can't find any sort of solid, permanent reality in there at all. So this is the anatta, selflessness. Okay. And at first that thought can be quite disturbing, oh, there's no self, I don't exist. Actually, when we understand it and when we begin to see it more directly, it brings great peace. because all of that, the dissatisfaction, the suffering, is this I that thinks, things aren't the way that they should be. There's something that I need that I haven't got. And it can never be satisfied because it's based on a misperception of reality. So when that sense of a solid, permanent me becomes less, when it kind of starts to dissolve, it takes away a lot of that kind of deep-seated mental disquiet that's there in the background of our lives, that underlies all more manifest experiences of suffering. It's this imaginary self that is suffering. Okay. And when we realize that it's not real, then the suffering is dissolved, disintegrated. So this is really, we're coming into the Four Noble Truths here, right? So again, it's leading naturally into the final aspect of the practice. The first noble truth is the noble truth of suffering. So we recognize that we do experience suffering, and we can observe it. We can observe suffering arising moment to moment in our experience if we pay attention. Even if we think, we think's fine, but if we look more closely, we will find it. And for the Buddha, this was the fundamental problem of human existence. And I think in a way, you can't deny it. The fundamental problem of human existence is that we suffer, and we don't want to suffer. We want to be free of suffering, but we don't know how to become free of suffering, right? So the Buddha gave this very, very direct, very logical analysis. He said, this is the problem. This is what motivated him to set off on his quest to leave his kingdom behind, and everything that he possessed, and all his kind of wonderful sort of worldly life that he had. He said, none of this has any real meaning if there's this universal human condition of suffering, and nobody knows how to bring it to an end. So he set off to find the solution. So, first of all, it's the recognition of that there is suffering, what it is. When we begin to see more clearly its nature, then we recognize, if it exists, it must have a cause. Therefore, if it's possible to remove the cause, to stop that cause, then the suffering itself will stop. So what is the cause of suffering? This is the Buddha's very, as I say, very logical, very practical inquiry. Well, what's the cause? So it's kind of like a doctor, where there's, we have a condition here, disease or, problem. What's the cause? Because if we want to cure it, we need to know the cause, and we need to stop that cause. So what's the cause of suffering? And the Buddha says that it's craving. Okay. So that needs a lot of thought. So first of all, he says, what is suffering? So what, monks, is the noble truth of suffering? And there's this classic statement. Birth is suffering. Old age is suffering. Death is suffering. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are suffering. Not to get what one wishes is suffering. In short, the 5 aggregates of clinging are suffering. So the words are exactly the same as the Buddha's first teaching, the Sutra of the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutra, or Sutra on the Four Noble Truths. He made this classic statement: this is what is suffering. And here he expands on that, it goes into more of a description of each of those, what they are. Because we need to recognize what is the nature of birth, aging, sickness, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. Looking them clearly in the face, because this is our situation. These things are inseparable from human existence. But we are not a prisoner to them, actually. So birth, aging, sickness, and death are suffering because we have craving, because because we want things to be different to how they are, actually. So if one is able to completely accept all of those, then they don't cause suffering, right? I mean, especially death, I think, in our culture anyway, most cultures probably, most people think this is death is something really terrible, really awful, an end to my existence, worst kind of suffering. But actually, it is possible, and many people are able to to face death and experience death with complete acceptance and inner peace. This is very possible. So the reason why it's suffering is because we are very, very strongly attached to life, which has to do with thinking that we should be something permanent, which we aren't. We're not permanent. And it is possible to come to terms with that and be at peace with that. Possible to come to terms with aging, be at peace with aging. Some people fight aging and fear aging and cause themselves terrible suffering. I'm losing my good looks, I'm losing my youth, I'm losing my health. It's awful because we're attached to those things. We think this is how it should be. I should be young and healthy and attractive, and that is not any longer quite so much the case, and it's getting less the case every day. It's becoming more of a reality to me at 67. But actually, I think I'm happier than I have ever been. So yeah, sometimes it would be nice to be young again. But the truth is that I can accept it, and I've known people who are very old who really accept their condition absolutely joyfully and serenely. It's perfectly possible. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair, all those things are suffering because of our mental attitudes to what happens to us, aren't they? And we can get to thinking, well, how could I possibly have any other attitude? There's a story of the Buddha. A woman came to him in absolute, total grief and despair. Her very young child had died. This is terrible. Can you give me something to bring back my child? And the Buddha said, yeah, take this rice bowl and fill it with rice, but you must take each grain of rice from a different house, and each house must be a house where no death has happened. So the woman took the bowl and went from house to house and came back, the bowl was empty. She couldn't find a house where nobody had died. And she realized, and many, many other people, the same thing had happened. And then it became possible for her to accept what had happened to her, because, the mind in that situation, the feeling is this, that, I am uniquely cursed. This terrible thing has happened to me, me. When you recognize that this is a universal condition, there's no escaping death, and everyone's experienced the death of a loved one, then it takes so much of that pain away, because we then connect with others. So yeah, so the suffering, and then the origin of suffering, the craving. Yeah. So he says, what is the noble truth of the origin of suffering? Is that craving, which gives rise to fresh rebirth, and bound up with pleasure and lust, finds ever fresh delight, now here and now there. To it, sensual craving for sense, pleasure, the craving for existence, in brackets, eternal existence, and the craving for non-existence. Interesting, isn't it? That as well, so sometimes we want to just be free from existence. We want to not exist anymore. Life's terrible. I want to be non-existent, and then, yeah, if we take that too, if that becomes too strong, and we take our own life, and then we wake up in the next rebirth, it hasn't solved the problem. So be careful going that way. Where does this craving arise and take root? Wherever in the world there are delightful and pleasurable things, there this craving arises and takes root. Eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind are delightful and pleasurable. There this craving arises and takes root. Visual forms, sounds, smells, tastes, bodily impressions, and mind objects are delightful and pleasurable. There this craving arises and takes root. Okay, so, and he gives a number of categories, like, all the aspects of our existence, each one, and interesting, he says, delightful and pleasurable. And yet he's also said, these 5 aggregates, which is everything that makes us up, is suffering. Kind of goes together, yes, we can take delight and pleasure in all of those things, and then we become attached to that, thinking, oh, that food was, that this fruit or whatever that I've eaten was so delicious, so I must have another one, until we've eaten too many figs or pears or whatever it is, and then it becomes suffering. So, thinking that this or that thing that we encounter with our senses or our mind is the source of happiness and pleasure. And therefore we cling to it, we grasp to it, we crave it. This creates suffering. So that's the cause, in one form or another. Craving for sense, pleasure, craving for eternal existence. So, for example, we want to be famous. Why do we want to be famous? Because the fame sort of is an affirmation of my existence, if you like, and my importance and permanence. If I'm famous, I think, people will remember me for years to come, but actually, eventually everyone gets forgotten. One day Shakespeare will be completely forgotten. Nobody will have heard his name. Right now it's hard to imagine, isn't it? But one day Shakespeare will not be famous. So these cravings, instead of being able to accept, as I said, this impermanent changing reality that we're not this permanent self. So then that takes us to the third noble truth, the cessation of suffering. When that craving stops, when we're able to let go of the craving, then there's no suffering. And how do we let go? By practicing the path, these eight practices, eightfold path. Right, starting with right understanding. So right view is just these 4 noble truths: to know what is suffering, what is the cause of suffering, what is the cessation of suffering, and what is the path. this is the right view or right understanding. Right thought, right speech, right action, right way to behave, because, you know, harmful actions that are motivated by the craving or its opposite, aversion, you know, that aversion is just craving stood on its head, isn't it? So things that we don't want, that we hate or fear, we want to avoid. It's like, well, we have a craving to not have those things. Do you see what I mean? Or with a, you know, what we're attached to is what we have an aversion to not having. They're really both the same thing in a different form. So those kind of emotions, when we act based on those, it perpetuates this process of suffering and rebirth. Right, livelihood, again, we need to avoid you know, earning our living from negative actions, because that is again creating causes for suffering. And then the last three, which belong to, so those last three, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, belong to ethics, moral discipline. The first one belongs to wisdom, right understanding, right view, and then the last three belong to concentration. So these are the three higher trainings we talk about. So effort, right mindfulness, and right meditation or right concentration. This together is the practice of concentration, training the mind. So only through that kind of mental training, based on a foundation of ethics, moral discipline, can we become completely free from suffering. So in terms of the practice itself, here then, with this, again, with this basis of having trained our mind in general awareness of everything that goes on in the mind, then we bring this element of the Four Noble Truths. You know, we see how everything that arises in our body, in our feelings, in our state of mind, in our mental contents of our mind, all of these have these four characteristics, if you like. You know, we can observe suffering, the cause of suffering, the cessation of suffering, moment by moment, in our experience of those, all of those elements of our being. Okay. So yeah. I mean, I'm not sure. Wasn't sure in the meditation whether to try to bring that in or not, but I thought this is too much, really. So I've spoken about it, and you've got that on the recording, and you've got the text of the sutra. There's not, there's not very much more in the book about it, but you can read the sutra, and just, you know, begin to bring that into the meditation. We'll talk more about that next time, and I will lead a meditation on that, and we'll have that on the recording, so you can practice with that if you want. But for the time being, I think mainly, you know, continue with what we've been doing. So, and I'm very sorry I didn't do the recording of the meditation, because what I'd like to suggest is, for next time, you know, over the next week, we're kind of bringing together all of the different things we've done so far. So I know those of you who weren't here earlier in the course, maybe a bit more difficult, but it's really, you know, the practice is very clearly described in this chapter 3 of the book. Okay, so I would suggest do whatever, you know, whatever aspects of that, you know, find most useful. But again, maybe trying to, you know, bring in this sort of overview meditation, where you're looking at all four aspects, you know, of the mind, the feelings, mental states, and the mind objects, as they're explained in chapter 3 of the book. Okay, that's my suggestion. So I'll stop there. Any questions before we finish? I know we're just a fraction over time, so I'll stop in a minute. Any questions? No. Okay, let's just take a moment or two to collect our thoughts and do a final dedication. I'll just come back into the body and focus the mind a little bit. So I've got a cramp in my legs here to move around a bit. Yeah, so just re-establish the posture and follow the rhythm of the breath. Still the mind for a moment or two. And so dedication is like setting an intention in the mind for the effect, positive influence of the practice that we've done tonight, meditating together and listening and discussing Dharma, and over the past week, whatever practice we've done, indeed of our whole life, whatever practice we've done too, just create an intention for that positive influence of that practice to not be lost, but to come to fruition and gaining the realizations of the path, moving towards greater self-awareness, understanding the realizations that we want on the path to enlightenment for our own benefit and ultimately for the benefit of all beings. May this practice become a cause for myself to move continuously towards enlightenment and be able to bring great benefit to others and ultimately to bring them also to complete freedom from suffering, complete enlightenment. Just take a moment to make that sincere prayer, if you like, in your heart, that sincere wish. May I become enlightened for the benefit of all. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings have happiness. May all beings reach the goal of the path. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Sorry, I've had a few technical problems tonight.
Oh, well, yeah, you seem to have a few of those, don't you? Is it internet?
Yeah,
around where you are?
Sorry.
Oh, not to worry. Well, we'll get there. Good night, all, and have a great week.
Thanks, David.
Good
night.
Thank you.
Night, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
See you, everybody.